Alright, so welcome back. This is the second formal lecture, and otherwise lecture number 3. What we will talk about in today's discussion is machines and the machining processes possible on those machines. We will limit our discussions to only what is commonly seen in the lab component of this course, even though there is no lab during this semester. Hopefully there might be in the summer. So we will talk mostly about machines that we commonly see in the labs. Now going on the past experience of the earlier recorded lecture, which I thought was too long. So what I will do for this discussion is I will break this lecture into two parts, part 1 and 2. In the first part I will talk about machines which are operated manually and the kind of operations or machining processes possible on those machines. And in part B of the lecture, I will talk about CNC machines and what their capabilities are and their working principles are. So that is the way I intend to structure this. The lecture is one, but I will break it into two videos. Now what we spoke about last time in the last lecture was mechanisms, and if you remember from that, mechanisms are essentially about the geometrical aspects of motion, and we spoke about several different mechanisms. And I mentioned there, and I will say this again, that a machine essentially is a collection of many different mechanisms. And essentially you collect those mechanisms because you want to move the tool in relation to the workpiece. You want relative motion between the tool and the workpiece so that there can be useful work, and that work typically for our concern is to actually make parts on these machines of interest for us. So that is what this lecture is about, is what is written in that first bullet there. And I already said this, that we are concerned with two types of machines, the manual as well as the CNC types. But first I'll talk about the manual machines, and then understanding the working principles of the CNC machines will become easier. And we will build on the earlier lecture. So if you have not watched it yet, I would encourage you to first go watch that, because all the mechanisms that we kind of discussed yesterday, we will again carry forward that discussion today when we talk about working principles of machines. Alright, so that is just broadly the outline of this lecture in a way. When I say manual machines, what I mean are only 3 machines that we are going to limit our discussions to. These 3 machines I have listed there in the bullets. The first is what is called a lathe machine, or also a turning machine, and what it is capable of you will see soon. The other machine that is of interest to us is the drilling machine, and drilling, I think the nomenclature is self-suggestive in the sense it is used to make holes, and milling machines are used essentially to make flat or free-form surfaces, which cannot otherwise be possible on the first 2 machines. So we'll talk about the working principle of all these 3 machines, and we'll go first with the lathe, then with the drilling, and then with the milling machine. So a lathe machine is a very classic machine. It is perhaps, there are some reports suggesting that it is as old as 3,000 years, or perhaps even older. There are records or documentary evidence to suggest that there are parts which could have only been made on a machine which does not look like this, but a version of this machine. This is a fairly modern version of a lathe machine. I've taken this image because this is representative of the machines we have in our labs. So as and when hopefully you have the opportunity, if I introduce nomenclature and working principle for this, you will also see that it applies to what you will then finally use in the lab. This is a manual lathe machine, very classic. It has got, I will talk you through each of the major components. So although there are a lot of labels, there is no reason to get intimidated yet. It has got 3 main components that we are interested in, 3 main sub-assemblies if we can call them. But before that, this machine is primarily used to make parts, to make features on parts that are round. Yeah? So there is a workpiece which is typically a rod or a bar or something like that, which is held in a chuck and that rotates, and then there is a tool which there is relative motion between that rotating workpiece and the tool, where you can impart motion to that tool and create any kind of surface on that rotating workpiece that you would like. So that is what this machine does. Its components are, like I said, they look intimidating, but I will talk you through each of them. The main part of this machine is what is called the bed or the base. Okay? So that is at the bottom, and everything else is supported on that base. There are three distinct regions I want to talk about. The one on the left, so on my left, also on your left, is what is called the headstock, which has the main motor and the gear drives and the spindle, and also which supports the workpiece that is rotating. Then there is something in the middle called the cross slide, which supports the tool which moves in relation to the workpiece, the rotating workpiece. And on the right hand side over here is something called the tailstock, which is also important but not as important as the headstock as well as the cross slide. So I'll first talk about the headstock. So like I said, everything is supported on the base. It is either sometimes cast altogether. So casting is this fundamental manufacturing process which is otherwise introduced to you at DA 201. So I will not talk about it here, but essentially that's how you make it. The base is typically cast. And on top of that you have a headstock, cross slide as well as a tailstock. This headstock within it, on the left hand side, has got typically a motor which is then connected through a set of pulleys and a lot of gear trains inside this headstock over here to be able to give drive to this spindle which is over here, which has a chuck which holds the workpiece, right, and the workpiece is rotating. So the purpose of this headstock is to give motion or transmit torque at some speed from a motor inside this, which you cannot see, through a pulley and a gearbox arrangement to this chuck which is holding the workpiece. This is also called the spindle or the chuck. This is what rotates. Now, inside this headstock is like we saw yesterday, a series of gear trains, and you want that because you want variable speeds at the output. So you want to be able to control which speed you can rotate that workpiece at, in how many rotations per minute. And that you can do, there is a control knob here, control setting, which you can manually select which speed to operate at. Oh, I must mention, this is the manual lathe machine. We're talking about manual machines. There is no human standing here, although you can imagine that I am the operator, and I will operate this machine and then create whatever is of interest, like you would have done if you were doing labs in this course, right? So there is normally a person also associated with this machine, not just one, sometimes two or more, because those are necessary to help load and unload the workpiece material from the machine. So this is the headstock. Inside there are pulleys and gear sets. You can change through these knobs here what speed you want to operate at, right? And that gives you rotation speed over here at within which the workpiece is mounted. So this is one of the main components. This is the heart of the machine, the spindle. The spindle is typically considered the heart because that's what transmits power or torque at some rotation speed. The other important component of the machine, so you see this already has mechanisms like we discussed yesterday. It's got a gear set inside, it's got a belt pulley arrangement, and sometimes it has got both. The other important component is the cross slide. The cross slide is also important because what it does, it supports the tool. So there is a tool which is mounted here, and that tool has to move with respect to the workpiece so that it can cut and remove materials. So remember, this course is only about subtractive machining processes, mostly, although we will have some discussion towards the end of these lectures about also additive manufacturing, but mostly they're only about subtractive. So like the name suggests, you will remove material going from the elastic state to the plastic state, to then fracture, then to remove that portion that is fractured, and that is why it is called subtractive. So this tool is essentially very important because this is what helps remove material. The tool is supported on a cross slide. This cross slide, like the name suggests, can give you cross motion. That means it can give you in-plane motion. Cross. So one motion that is possible for us is along the axis of the workpiece. So this is the axis of the workpiece. The machine tool nomenclature, the axis of the workpiece is called the Z-axis along the spindle. So there is one motion possible for this cross slide and the tool mounted on that along the Z-axis. So if this is my workpiece, I can move my tool in relation to that, right? So that is what is possible with this cross slide. The way it gets drive, the way this cross slide gets motion is through a screw nut mechanism. This is a screw that is shown here, the lead screw. It is essentially a screw with some special kind of pitch profile, thread profile. This is a lead screw, and the nut is mounted within this cross slide. And because the screw is fixed at both ends, it cannot move, it can only rotate. And its drive is either manual or it can also come automated through the gearbox inside this headstock. And because the lead screw ends are fixed, it can only rotate in place, the nut translates on that screw. So you get, again, rotational to translation motion using a mechanism we spoke about here in the video that we recorded earlier in lecture number 2. So that is one set of motion possible. The other set of motion possible is cross in, so this is along the z-axis, so along the spindle axis, and one is in and out of the plane of this board. That is the x-axis. So we follow a right-hand nomenclature in machine tool for axis description. If this is the z, that has to be the x, and then that is the y. There is no motion in the y direction for this machine. This is a very classic machine. There are machines which also allow you motion in the y-axis. This is not one such machine, because we don't even have such machines in our labs, so I thought of only introducing the classic machine. The motion in the x-axis, which is in and out of the plane of the board, is also with a screw nut mechanism. So there is a screw, again held between two centers, and there is a nut which is essentially supported on this compound rest. And there is a hand wheel here. If you rotate, you are rotating the screw in place, and because the screws ends are fixed, the nut will translate over. So again, another example of rotational to linear motion, again through a screw nut mechanism. So we spoke about this yesterday also. All the mechanisms you see there are also here, and they're necessary because a machine is essentially a collection of mechanisms, but those mechanisms, when they come together, they do work for us. And the work is to give workpiece the final shape and form so that it becomes of a functional use. On this cross slide, on the top, you have a tool post which mounts within it the cutting tool. What the cutting tool is and how it works, we'll talk about in the subsequent slides. But for now, it is safe to say that the purpose of this cross slide is to move this tool relative to the workpiece in the plane of motion. So I can move in the x, which is in and out, and I can move along the length of this machine, which is the z-axis. They both use screw nut mechanism. They're both controlled independently using hand levers or these rotational wheels. The third thing, so just before I go to the third aspect, which is the tailstock, it is also possible to simultaneously control both of these, again using your skill if you have that. So if I want, I can move the machine along the z as well along the x. So I will get actually perhaps some kind of linear tapered motion in the plane, if that's what I so desire. That is possible, but that requires some serious skill, which is either practiced or it is learned through a lot of experimentation. If you would have done this lab, you would have operated these machines and you would have seen how difficult it is to coordinate two independent axes simultaneously using your own hands. It's not trivial. But almost all of the staff in the lab, so typically this course we had many groups like I discussed, and each group had one mentor who was the lab staff, and that person used to help train you to operate these machines. And unfortunately you can't do that now, but hopefully in the summer you will all get an opportunity to use these machines to make parts for your projects. So it's possible to also control them simultaneously. It requires some serious skill. The third aspect of this machine is the tailstock. The tailstock is normally not what is called a live tailstock, it is a dead tailstock. In the sense there is no drive given to this. There is drive only given to the spindle. But sometimes you can also have a live tailstock where there is another motor here also rotating, also through a gear drive, and the tailstock is also rotating. The purpose of this tailstock is not so much to hold an independent workpiece. It is if you have a very long rod, which because it is so long, it is very flexible, it can buckle and bend. You don't want that to happen, so you can support that very long rod at the end using a tailstock. So what it has here is something called a quill. You support that long piece which is held over here between two centers, and this quill, this tailstock quill, can move in and out. And the way this moves in and out, so this can be extended or contracted, is again using a hand wheel. So rotational to translational motion. Again, a screw nut mechanism. So everything that we discussed in the mechanism you see are being actually used in this machine. The tailstock can also be moved, so this entire body can be moved forward and backwards depending on the length and the diameter of the workpiece of interest. And all of these things, the tailstock as well as the cross slide, are being guided on what are called flat ways or carriages. These guides are essentially bearing surfaces, so there is something moving with respect to on top of each other. So that is what this machine is like. When you are cutting, because you're going from the elastic state to the plastic state to fracturing and breaking away chips or material, all that material has to go somewhere. So through gravity it falls into this chip bin or chip pan at the bottom. This is nothing but a tray, and you collect it over here, and then after some time you remove it and then you get rid of it or dispose of it. So that is essentially the working principle of a lathe. It is actually a very interesting machine, very classic machine. It has been used, like I said. There are reports suggesting that it has been used up to perhaps 3,000 years ago. I am a little skeptical about those reports, but there are reports, including some in our own country, where there are these reports of these pillars in these classic old ancient temples, which were made of stone and then turned on machines like this. Doing that even today is going to be difficult, so that's why I have my doubts, but who knows. Alright, so this is just the overview of the machine. To give you a sense of a little more detail of some of its components, I will discuss what is called the chuck and its holding principle, and then I'll talk a little about tool and tool geometry and the kind of operations possible on this machine. Okay, so this is the other really important part of this machine, which is called chuck. The chuck essentially does the job. So this is the tool I was talking about. The chuck is holding this workpiece. The workpiece is rotating because that is the kind of motion it gets from the motor through a set of pulleys and gears. And this is rotating, and the tool is being given relative motion to that rotation of the workpiece. So you can see the tool is being fed along the axis of the workpiece. And by doing that, you're reducing its diameter from some diameter d0 to a final diameter df, which is the finished diameter. And this small d is essentially the depth of cut. So that is how much material you removed in per pass. So in one pass of this tool moving over the workpiece, you reduce the diameter of that workpiece by so much. This is under your control. How fast you move, this is under your control. What speed you rotate, this is under your control. The geometry of this is under your control. How you maneuver, this is also under your control because it's a manual machine. What is interesting here and what I want to point out in this slide is how this workpiece is held in these jaws. So these jaws are shown in red. There is one more at the back. You can't say it's a 3-jaw chuck. And the working principle to hold this, because this is really important, right? Because there are forces generated during machining because of moving the material from elastic to plastic to fracture. You're removing material that requires force, requires energy. So the gripping force for the workpiece has to be substantially higher than any possible working level force. So to grip this really rigidly, you use a 3-jaw chuck, and because most workpieces are round, fortunately, you would like that all of these self-center so that it grips, and the axis of rotation of the chuck is the same as the axis of rotation of the workpiece. So I will just play a little animation which shows you how this 3-jaw self-centering mechanism works. It's actually really nice, I really like it. So this is essentially, I should have gone there. So I'm having trouble advancing the slides, so I will go to my laptop. Okay. So this is essentially the 3-jaw chuck. This is a key which you can see is being rotated, and these jaws are translating in and out. So again, rotation to translation, another mechanism. This is a little different, but if you see closely, this is the bevel gear. The key is rotating a bevel gear, and the bevel gear is then indexing that motion 90 degrees, because that's what bevel gears do. This is the axis of rotation for this small bevel gear, but the axis of that big bevel gear is different. It's 90 degrees, it's orthogonal. And that bevel gear, so there are teeth in its front side, and the back side of that bevel gear, there are slots, grooves. And these jaws also have grooves behind them. You can see these teeth, right? And these jaws are essentially moving within these grooves, and these grooves are spiral, which are cut on the back side of that bevel gear. And as you rotate this, that is why these jaws translate. A really nice mechanism, very well done. Whoever conceived of this many hundreds of years ago. And this is still the classic mechanism used. So almost all our lathe machines which have these chucks to mount the workpiece, so to grip it really rigidly, use this mechanism on them. This is not a self-locking kind of mechanism, but the gripping force is sufficient and significantly high so that it doesn't release. But this is really nice. Just to make this a little more clear, in case it is not, I will play another video. There is some issue with my advancer, so I will manually advance the slide. So this is another example of the same thing, but now a real, instead of an animation, this is the real deal. What you can see again is that there is a key rotating there, and these things are translating in and out. So this person will disassemble it to give you a clearer view of what is really happening inside. So as you can see now, he will remove this. There are 3 bevel gears, 1, 2, 3, and the key that you put in is going to drive any of these 3 bevel gears. There are 3 because you can put this key anywhere. You don't have to always put it at the same bevel gear. So these are bevel gears which are indexing rotation, and then behind that bevel gear, like I said, there are spiral grooves, and those jaws which translate in and out are moving on those grooves which are cut behind this bevel gear, which is what will now become plane when we disassemble this. It requires a little skill to disassemble, as you can see. Okay, so these are the spiral grooves I said which are behind that thing, and now he is disassembling it, and the jaws have also come out. And this is just the arrangement to show you that when you rotate that, these jaws move inside these spiral cut grooves. So that's the only point I wanted to make from that animation as well as that disassembly video. Alright. So to come back, what I just digressed for is just to show you the working principle of this. But what I will now talk about is the geometry of this tool. So this is the simplest kind of operation, turning, which is to reduce the diameter of the workpiece. This is external turning. You can also have internal turning, where you can increase the size of a bore, but I'll talk about that subsequently. So what I will now define is just the geometry of this tool, the simplest kind of tool. Alright, so what we were talking about is the geometry of this tool, which is used for OD or outer diameter turning, which is to reduce the size of the workpiece. These are 4 different views of the workpiece of this tool. We'll look at first only the top view, which gives us a sense of this. This is the cutting bit shown in the red at the free end over here where my finger is. There is only one major cutting edge, which is the edge over here, and that is the edge that is in contact with the workpiece. It is actually very sharp, sometimes as sharp as a knife, sometimes sharper, and it is of a very different material than your knives, because it has to cut hardened steel also sometimes. So this is the main cutting edge, and that edge is supported by a lot of other geometric parameters which are actually very important. So what happens is this: when this is in contact with the workpiece, the chip is formed on this face of the tool. It curls on this what is called the rake face, and then curls and then breaks and then shears away, and that is how material is removed. So the 3 important parameters on the rake face you can see is, one is of course what is called the side cutting edge angle. So that is the angle that the cutting edge makes with this side. Then there is also something called the end cutting edge angle, which is the clearance, and there is something called the nose radius. So there is always a finite nose radius on the tool. It is not possible to make anything which is perfectly sharp. But this radius is actually can vary from zero point 0.1 millimeter to sometimes 3 to 5 millimeters. In this case, it is 3.2, which is pretty high. There are some other geometric parameters in each of these views. As you can see, there are some clearance angles here on the side view, as well as the sectional view, as well as this view. Each of these clearance angles is important because what it helps you do, although only one edge is cutting, you don't want any of the other edges or the faces of the tool to be in contact with the workpiece. There will be a lot of rubbing, a lot of friction, a lot of waste of energy in overcoming all those things which are actually not supposed to take place. You're only supposed to have contact with the tool, with the workpiece only at the cutting edge. So there are all these clearance angles and relief angles and end relief angle and end clearance angles. These are essentially to define the geometry of this cutting edge. This is a simple tool, and if you can see this has, let's count. So it's got 3 different geometric parameters on this view. It's got 2 more over here, so that's 5. Oh, sorry, 3 more over here, so that's 6. It's got 2 more here, so that's 8. And it's got 3 more over here. There's also a back rake angle. That's 11 different geometric parameters to define one simple cutting edge geometry. 1. And this is for the simplest kind of tool possible. As you will see when we will discuss in the subsequent slides, tool geometries can be a little more complicated compared to this Mickey Mouse kind of simple geometry. But even for this, there are 11 different parameters to define. And each of these are actually important. They're not just for the tool to look good. They're there because they are also important in how they contribute to cutting. And there are analytical models which use these geometries as inputs, which can predict the force and power consumed during cutting, and you can use these to, in a way, design tools to minimize force and power. And that is what we normally do, but we will not talk about that in this course. So this is the simplest, like I said, this makes possible cutting operation possible like this. So the edge that you see is below this thing. This red color chip that is coming out, that is what is curling over the rake face. So we were looking down at the top face where we looked at the main cutting edge and its nose radius. And the rake face is where the chip curls over and comes out. We'll talk a little more about the mechanics of machining in the subsequent lectures, but for now we will just discuss tool geometry and different kinds of tools. Alright, so what we showed you earlier in the detailed geometry for one tool, those 11 different parameters, is for the tool in A, which is for straight turning, and you saw that you're locally reducing the diameter. There are many other operations possible on that manual machine. One of them is called taper turning, in which you're essentially creating a taper on the workpiece. There are 2 ways to do this, and I'll talk about both. There is profiling, in which again you're making some kind of free-form surface. This is spherical in this case. Not trivial, it requires a lot of skill. There is what is called turning and grooving, facing and face grooving. I'll come back to these, but first let's look at what taper turning is. If I want to create a taper at some angle, so there is a diameter which is small here and larger here and is continuously varying, the question is how to make this. And if you remember the kinematics of the machine, so that is the machine they're made on, the motion of the cross slide is possible along the axis of the workpiece, so along the z-axis, as well as in an orthogonal direction which is called the x-axis. There is no motion in the y, okay? So no motion up and down. Left and right and in and out. So clearly if I am able to manipulate the motion of the tool using 2 of these hand wheels, such that I can create this kind of planar motion, which is necessary for creating taper, I will be able to create a taper. But for that I need simultaneously control of 2 hand wheels, which is not so trivial like I mentioned earlier. So instead to do that, what you can also do is that tool post that you had on the top, I'll show you that again. The tool post that you had on the top, you can actually index that tool post by whatever orientation you would like, so that is allowed. You can rotate this, there is an axis allowed there, but you have to fix it after rotating it. So once you rotate it, all you do is then you do straight turning, and because the tool is already rotated, indexed, it can create a taper on its own. So that is the feed direction of the tool. That is also possible. People do that all the time. So you're rotating the tool and then creating that taper. Or then you simultaneously control two axes, which is not easy. If you can do that, that is simultaneously control two axes, then you can also perhaps do this. Because you see, this is also simultaneous manipulation of both these individual axes, the Z as well as the X, to create a free-form profile like this. So you can also do profiling on turning machines if you have the skill for that. And it is not easy, but like I said, most of the people in the lab staff has that skill, and they should be able to demonstrate this to you if you so need it. The other thing that is possible is grooving. So grooving is where so this is step change in diameter. Grooving is where you have a step change in the diameter between two sections which have a different diameter. So on the left and the right, there are two sections which have a different bigger diameter, and locally in the middle you have a smaller diameter. So it's called a groove. This is a very wide groove. So you can make a small groove and then you can enlarge it. So it's turning and grooving. Like you can do external, you can also do grooving on the face. In this case, the field motion is along the axis of the workpiece, rotational axis. In this case, the field motion is also along the axis, but the tool is indexed 90 degrees. This face turning operation. These grooves that you see that are made here, there is an axis of rotation which should have been shown. These grooves are necessary when you want to make grooves to house O-rings or seals, which are necessary for when you have two mating surfaces which come into contact and you don't want anything to spill out if there is oil between those two. So these are typically used in all mating surface applications and rotating applications where you have seals and O-rings and things like that. So that's also a necessary operation. It's possible on the lathe machine. Facing is now you see the direction of the tool. The feed motion, the direction in which the tool moves, is different than turning, OD, as well as taper, or as well as face. It is perpendicular to this case, or to this case. So what you are doing is in a way you are lessening the length of the workpiece by getting rid of all this material here. So facing is locally reducing the diameter to also sometimes reduce the length. These are some, there are many more operations possible on the lathe machine. I'll talk about a few more. Just a few more. There are many more even beyond these, but we can't possibly discuss them all here. So this is just an overview. This example is cutting with a form tool, where what you do is if you have a very complicated free-form profile you want to make on the workpiece, and you have many such workpieces that you want to make, you want to mass produce a workpiece with a profile as shown here. It's possible, you can, but you require a lot of skill. Right? Because for the case of that one spherical profile I showed you earlier requires simultaneous manipulation of the tool in the plane. You have to do that again and again and again for every workpiece you want to create. So the other way out of that is you create a tool which has the same negative profile, and then you take that tool and you plunge it. So you plunge that tool into the workpiece and you get the same positive profile that you would like. So this is classic male-female geometry. You plunge and you get whatever negative profile you have. This is one operation. This I said is also very important, boring. So earlier I showed you example of external turning where you reduce the outer diameter. This is you're increasing the inner diameter. So there is already a hole inside this workpiece made by drilling. Drilling you're familiar with. Drilling is essentially making a hole. You don't have to go to a drill machine to make a hole. What you can do, if I go back, is this is the same machine. If I put a drill bit in the tailstock, and the workpiece is over here in which I want to make a hole, and I rotate this hand wheel for the drill comes out. And because this is rotating, the drill is going inside, it's creating a hole. So you can also do drilling inside the turning machine. So you create a hole with drilling and then you enlarge that hole using boring. The reason you do that is because this is not a finishing operation. In case you want a very good surface finish, because your application so desires it, you have to do what is called boring. Boring is also called internal turning in case you don't like the word boring. And boring is not boring, I must tell you, it's one of the most difficult operations. In fact, all your engine bores, right, the cylinders in which this, like we showed you the animation yesterday, For the 4-stroke engine, the piston moves inside the cylinder bore, which is the hole, is made using boring. A lot of other bores actually are finished using boring. Boring is not trivial. Another operation possible is cutting off. This is like grooving, right? Where you are plunging the tool into the workpiece and you are now in a way cutting off everything on the right hand side. It's called parting off. Sometimes you need that because you have a very long rod and you only want to work with a certain section of the rod, you get rid of everything else. You can also do threading on the tool, on the workpiece, on the lathe machine. I'll talk about this in the next slide. But this is really nice, this is possible. And then finally you can do what is called knurling. This is not so much a machining operation, but this is also necessary. What knurling does is on the workpiece, sometimes because all these are nice finished machine surfaces, they're actually very smooth and you can, if you want to grip something, you can lose that grip. So what knurling does, it creates a hash or a hatch pattern on the outer surface of that tool, of that workpiece. So you will see, in fact, if you go to your kitchen, you might find utensils which have these knurled patterns on them to increase grip. Not just in kitchens, sometimes in hammers. A lot of hammers also on their handles have these knurls to increase grip on them. So that is also possible. This is strictly not a machining operation. This is more a forming operation where you make material flow plastically. But that is also possible on this machine. Threading, like I said, is also possible. I will just show you what I mean by threading. So if you are doing this lab, if these were normal circumstances, almost all of you would have made threaded parts on the turning machine. This is an example of what a thread looks like. You don't worry about all the nomenclature. What I just want to show you is the pitch and the profile. Now this looks like very similar to the form tool profile I showed you. And that is one way you can make the threads actually. You plunge into this. So you make the same thread profile on the form tool and then you plunge. Right? That is possible. But sometimes that is not the most effective way to do it. In fact, that is the way to mass produce for threads in rolling. We also have form dies and you roll a rod or a bar between these dies to make these threaded patterns. But the way we make them on lathe machines is you have a tool which will move every pitch in one rotation of the workpiece. So as this rotates, your tool moves. And that is kind of interesting. It's like a dancing mechanism when you see it in play. And it's really nice, and the way it works is, so you have multi-pass. In the first pass, what you do is a very low depth of cut, so you don't, the plunge inside the workpiece is of a small axial depth of cut. And when you move this, the way you translate the tool is for every rotation of the workpiece, you move one pitch. Only then can you make a threaded profile. If the pitch is very large, right, you will see that you have really these significant jumps as this rotates. Looks very nice. And then you repeat that by increasing the plunge depth. So you plunge a little more and then you repeat that process and you make a thread. That is the way threads are made on lathe machines. This is not the way to mass produce threads. This is one way. This is what is nice and useful if you have fewer parts, which is typically what you make in your lab work, in your project work. Only one part which needs threads on it, and each has a different pitch. So that is what we prefer to do. This is also something you would do on your own if you were here and taking this course in the lab. So this is just an overview of what all is possible on this turning machine. I kind of gave you an overview of its working principle, of its key components, of the mechanisms that go into making this machine, so that it can do processes like I outlined. What I outlined is only few of the processes. There are many more that are possible, but I will not talk about those today. And also the mechanics of all of these processes is actually very complicated. So by mechanics I mean the nature of deformation to go from, this is all dynamic plasticity, which are subjects in themselves. We will talk a little about that later in the course, not right now. This is just to give you an overview. So like I gave you an overview for turning, I will briefly discuss drilling, and then I'll also discuss a little of milling before we close this part 1 of the lecture on manual machines. So this is an overview of a drilling machine. I have to spend more time on this during the lecture, because otherwise you would have seen this first hand in the lab. We would have explained the working principles of all of these things to you in the lab. And seeing and doing is one way to learn, which I think is the correct way, especially in courses like this. But because of our circumstances, I will spend a little more time explaining the working principle. And hopefully when you come, you will be able to then refresh, because these videos should still be available. You can watch them and then do the labs. So drilling is, you're familiar with, drilling holes. That's where it comes from. You have a tool that rotates. You have a workpiece which is kept on this table, which you will fix and fasten and hold down with clamps or other arrangements. And you will make holes inside that workpiece by using drill bits. So what you need to do is fix the workpiece, and you only need to give motion to the tool which is rotating and then being plunged into the workpiece. So the kind of conceptual framework for this machine is much simpler than the lathe machine. This is a drill machine which is very simple actually. We have more elaborate mechanisms for drilling machines also. We have some of those machines in our labs, but we normally don't use them in this course. So I will introduce only the basic kind of drilling machine that you are familiar with, that you will get to see in the labs. So this is like that. It's got a base, it's got a column. On that column again, on the top there will be a motor, there will be a pulley or a gear train to give drive to this spindle, which is actually supporting a chuck inside which the drill bit is mounted. There is a hand wheel. There is a hand wheel which you will rotate, and the drill bit will come down, and as you rotate it, you can go deeper and deeper into the workpiece in which you want to make a hole. So that is all there is to this. This is a very simple machine, very simple working procedure. The only drive is being given to the drill shaft or the drill spindle that comes through a belt pulley arrangement or a set of gears trains. And you can change the speed like you can in the sense in the turning machine like I showed you. I spent a little time talking about the chuck principle for the drill machine because it's a little different than the turning machine, but it's also really nice. Because you will be gripping different tools or different drill bits of different sizes inside this chuck, you want this chuck to be adjustable, and so its working principle is very similar to the 3-jaw chuck. These are also 3 jaws. This is a nut which has grooves inside it. As you rotate that nut, the jaws translate. Very similar to the 3-jaw chuck I showed you earlier, right? But also really nice mechanism. What you will do is you will insert a drill bit at the bottom, and you will open and close this nut, or rotate this nut, and that will open and close these jaws, and you can have different drill bits of different diameters that you can insert and then again tighten and lock. So that is the chucking principle in drilling machines, very similar like we saw earlier. Like I said, there are grooves and slots in the jaws. The kind of drills you can put inside that chuck, which are commonly used in the labs, is the first is the standard twist drill. And if you look at it carefully, it actually looks like somebody's taken a rod and twisted it, and that's why there are these grooves and flutes on top of it. That's why it's called a twist drill. Drilling is only taking place at the bottom, at these bottom flutes, not on the sides. It's very different than milling, which I will talk about later. And because it is going only cutting at the bottom, and because this is going inside a hole, you have to have some mechanism of chip evacuation. Right? If you remember, I have said this several times. All these are subtractive processes. That means you are removing, shearing away material in every rotation that you are cutting. You are removing material. That material has to go out somewhere. And because you are going inside a hole, the only way to evacuate that material that you cut away is through these channels or grooves that come out. And that is why these, when they twist, there is a path for these drill chips to also come out and exit the hole. These actually play 2 roles. There is a very important role actually, because without this you can't evacuate the chips. And if you can't evacuate, they will just get stuck there and you will not be able to drill further. So this drill geometry actually is very complicated. I will not spend time discussing it here. We have another advanced elective in which we talk about mechanics of machining processes, and we spend a little time on their geometry, but not in this course. You saw for that simple turning geometry, one tool, there are 11 different parameters. This has got 2 cutting edges. 2. All turning is at 1 cutting edge. Besides the special form tool, all turning is a single cutting edge. This is 2 cutting edges. So the geometry of each of these is slightly different and actually very involved, so I will not spend time on this here. This is a twist drill. Sometimes if you don't have this flute, you can also have a straight flute. It's called a straight flute drill. Names are self-explanatory, right? This is not very often used. I also don't like it because it clogs chips. But depending on the application of interest, this has more strength, core strength than this, because drill gets weakened because of this wrapping of these flutes around it. They're not wrapped, that's how they're machined. Sometimes you prefer to use a straight flute drill also. This is a step drill. As you can see, there is a small drill bit at the free end, and then there is another drill bit over here. So what you do is, because you make a small hole and then you go enlarge that hole. And you do that in one setup. Instead of using 2 drills, where you first have a thin, long drill, you make a small hole, then you remove that drill, and then you take a bigger drill and you go make a bigger hole. You can make them in one tool. So the combination tool is called a step drill because there are 2 drills inside one drill. A spade drill is something which we also like sometimes because all these are made of solid, mostly carbide. So carbide is this very high density hardness material which helps you cut other materials. They're also made of what is called high speed steel sometimes, which is a misnomer because high speed steel was the word given to it in 1907 or 1908. And at that time the material was very high, as in it was used in high speeds. We are sitting in 2020. Those speeds are no longer high, they're actually very low. We never operate machines at those speeds ever. So calling something high speed steel is no longer viable. All that is outdated. We use carbides which can go at much higher speeds and to cut material. But because they are made solid, right, they're made of one rod, machined out of ground out of one bar. So grinding another machining process, we'll not talk about it here. If they break, it's sometimes difficult to replace, also expensive. So we prefer spade drills in which only the drill body, the drill bit at the bottom, this is detachable, you can remove this. So if case one of the edges breaks, you just remove this and you put another modular drill bit at the bottom and you cut with that. That's also possible in spade drill. Gun drill, as the name suggests, is for drilling deep bores like they're used in the ones in gun barrels. The length to diameter ratio, so diameter, all of you are familiar with guns that you see in movies, some of you might have seen in real life. They are very narrow bores and the diameter is a little bigger than the diameter of the bullet. And because the drill is, right, because you have to drill that, right, you have to first make a hole so that the bullet can come out. That's not very trivial. You make special drills for that called gun drills. They are very different geometry than all the drills before that. This is actually not trivial because first you drill, then you go bore, and then finally you get a nice looking gun barrel. But this is used in those applications, very long, very high length to diameter ratio applications. Its geometry here, its geometry at the edge is very different than these geometries. So again, I will not talk about it. Just an overview. These are some of the other operations possible on drilling machines. Some I will talk about. This is the first operation. It's called center drilling, where you actually make a small hole which then guides the main drilling. So the first operation you do is normally center drill, which gives you a center so that this can follow that axis. Because sometimes these are actually very flexible tools. They can go off into their own axis. They will not follow the path you want to give or you would like them to. Hence you do what is called center drilling and then you do drilling. After drilling, if you would like to enlarge that bore, you do counter drilling. So you take, this is a pre-drilled bore or a hole, you can make it bigger with a counter drill. A step drill I already showed you. Instead of doing this separately, you can combine them into one tool. It's called step drilling, where there is no pilot bore. there is no center drilling. The step drill size is small enough that it acts as the pilot and the guide. There is also counter boring and counter sinking, which are used because if you see there is already a pilot board. This is not cutting the bottom portion, it is guiding inside that pilot board. And the sides and the bottom are cutting because what you would like is to make a seat, for example, for a stud or a screw. So if some of you have seen screws, and if you've not, I encourage you to open up something around you and look at screws. They have heads on them, and their heads are all differently shaped. Sometimes they have a cone, sometimes they have a flat, and because you would like their head to go and sit nicely inside a pocket, you need to make that pocket, and that's why it's called counter boring or counter sinking, which is actually cutting the profile of the head of the screw. Reaming is a finishing drilling operation. So you normally drill first you center drill, then you drill, and then you ream. So reaming is very small material removal. It is like boring and turning, where you are finishing the bore which is already there by just enlarging it a little more. Reaming is like that. Okay, that was to give you an overview of what is possible in drilling machines. I will now move on to discussing milling machines, manual type. And there are two that we will discuss. One is called the horizontal and one is called the vertical. But drilling is kind of straightforward. There's not so many complications here. Alright, this is called horizontal configuration manual milling machine. We also have vertical configuration, and I'll talk about those after I talk about this. So as you can see in this, there is a tool which is very different looking than the ones you saw in turning or milling. This is the tool, right? What I'm pointing at. And that tool has not one but multiple cutting edges. It can have 2, 3, 5, 8, 10, 20 as you like. And each of their geometries is very different than what we discussed in turning. Drilling we did not discuss, but that is also multi-point cutting. So this is typically used when you want higher productivity, because the amount of material you remove per unit time is a function of how many cutting edges you have. And you also use this when it is not, so this is not for round surfaces mostly, it is mostly to flat surfaces. So in this case what we have is a workpiece which is kept on a table, and I would like to reduce the thickness of that workpiece. So what I do is mill. So I am creating another flat surface on that workpiece. I can also create free-form surfaces. If I like, I can have a sinusoidal surface on this profile, and that's possible in milling. It's not possible in turning, it's not possible in drilling. So milling allows you to do that. And the kind of relative motion I give to my tool and workpiece here is similar like drilling and turning, where in this case the tool is fixed between some centers and it is rotating. Right? There is a base, there is a column. The column again has a motor housing which is coupled which is giving drive to this tool, again through a belt pulley and a gear train set arrangement inside this, which you cannot see, and it is all there though. And you can change the level of speeds that you want to rotate the tool at by again maneuvering those knobs at the back of the machine typically, and which you're essentially doing is changing the gear set that is in contact with each other. Like you change gears in cars, it is very similar here. So you can change that speed of operation and all that is inside that. So the same mechanism of gear motion transfer is here, pulleys are also here. You give that rotary motion to the tool. In turning you gave rotary motion to the workpiece. In drilling you rotated the tool. In milling also you rotate the tool. The workpiece is moving in plane, or it's got translational motion. It's got 3 motions possible, 3 degrees of freedom, all translational. So you can see the one is, so the z-axis again in this case is always parallel to the spindle axis, and this is the spindle, so the z-axis is parallel to that. There is an x-axis motion, if you use right hand rule. There is an x-axis motion, there is a y-axis motion which is up and down, and then there is z-axis which is moving in and out, which is this. This motion here of the table moving in and out is z, cross is x, and up and down is y. Each of these, so the table, so again here you have a cross. In the turning machine you had a cross slide, here you have a saddle. And the saddle can move in plane and this knee can also move up and down, and that is how this workpiece can be brought closer or can be moved away from the fixed tool which is rotating in between some centers. So that is essentially what there is to this machine. The kind of drive for each of these axes is again a screw nut arrangement like we saw in turning in the lathe machine. It has a similar screw which is driven by a motor, and that screw is, so the nuts are on each of these components because the screws are fixed between centers and the nuts are either on the table or on the saddle or on the knee. Those nuts will translate and you will get translational motion at the workpiece which you are finally interested in. That is how these machines work. Whether they are horizontal or vertical, it doesn't really matter. Their kinematics are similar. So the motion to the workpiece is the same. What makes it horizontal is that the spindle is horizontal. The spindle is parallel to the ground. Right? The spindle is this thing here where the tool is mounted. Because the spindle is parallel to the ground, it is called horizontal configuration. If the spindle was vertical, you would call it a vertical milling machine. That's all there is to it. The same thing at the bottom you will have. To move the tool, to move the workpiece. You will have XYZ motion possible on the workpiece. Normally not on the tool. To give you a little sense of how the tool is clamped here is very different than it was in the drill chuck or how the workpiece was clamped inside the turning machine. So I'll just briefly talk about that, and then we'll talk about the kind of machining operations possible on this. Alright, so this is that tool. So like I said, this is the milling cutter. It has multiple teeth, as you can see. Sometimes it is a solid cutter, sometimes it is like the spade drill where you have modular cutters which you can remove and replace if one of them breaks. And you can see that I can change this cutter, right? It does not have to be of the same width or the same diameter. I can disassemble it by removing these nuts and spacers. I remove this from one side and I put how many other tools I would like to. I can put 1, 2, 3, 5, or I can put a thicker one or a bigger one. That is my choice depending on my application. The way it receives drive is through the spindle. There is a spindle at the back. There is no chucking here like there was in the drill bit or like there was in the workpiece for turning. This is held between centers in an arbor, and you can assemble, disassemble. You can position this anywhere along this axis. And where to position it depends on what you are cutting on the table. This is the spindle which goes inside. This is a taper which goes inside. There is something which is actually special about this taper. The angle of the cone makes it either self-locking or self-release. There are both types. So what I mean by self-locking is I can just insert it in the bore which has the same taper, and because of the angle on that cone there is friction, and that goes and locks by itself because of the friction angle. Similarly, there are other angles you can make on this cone which are called self-release. So a simple push or a pull, a push from the back or a pull from here will cause that taper to release. So there are also self-release tapers. There is something significant about this. There's been a lot of thought process that people have put into in designing things like this. It's not trivial, you must appreciate. Everything has been thought about, has been engineered. So this is essentially what this mounting arrangement for the tool in milling looks like. It is different than in turning or in drilling. And it is modular, that in the sense you can remove this cutter and you can put any which other like that you like. So to just give you a sense of what are the kind of machining operations possible now with manual milling machines, I will discuss just a few. These are just some examples. This is what I showed you in the first slide on the milling machine. This is called slab milling. You have a very, very thick, wide cutter, multiple edges on its periphery, each of them sharp, each of them is cutting. And you see what it is doing, it is reducing the thickness of the slab from some original dimension to some finished dimension. And how much you want to reduce depends on how much this is in contact with the workpiece. Right? So this is just in plane machining, you can reduce the thickness. This is called straddle milling or gang milling. This is called form milling, which is kind of like this, but this is different. Here, instead of having one cutter, you have two. Like I said earlier, in that arbor, You can put 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cutters if you like, and you can all cut in tandem. So you want to do this because you want to have a step on that workpiece in the middle, your application so demands it. And you don't want to only cut one side first and then move the workpiece on the table and then cut the other side. You can then do them both together, much higher productivity, which is possible on this machine. These are two different cutters. You can do form milling like you did in form cutting, in form turning, or in form threading. You can also do form milling, where you create, if you have a workpiece which has to have been mass produced with a profile like this, you have a negative profile on the cutter, and then you just pass the cutter in relation to the workpiece, you move it relative to each other, and you get the profile that you would like. So this is form milling. Gear cutting is also a form cutter. I showed you this in the lecture video when we discussed how gears are made, at least in our labs. Not the hobbing method to make gears, which is a really mass producing method. This is where we cut each tooth individually. So the profile on the form milling cutter is that of an involute tooth. This rotates about this axis, and I feed this into the blank of the gear, and I cut one tooth. Once that is done, I index the blank, I rotate the blank by some pitch, the circular pitch I know, which depends on the module and the diameter and the number of teeth. We discussed that in the earlier lecture. And then again pass this tooth over the next blank or the next space, and I get another tooth. That is how I make gears in milling. I can also make slots, which is something similar to straddle, but only in here my either sides have a higher the height of their wall, and I'm making a slot in the middle. Like you, I made a slot in grooving, but that was round. Here it is in flat. I can also do slitting, where I can separate these two if I like. This is like a sawing cutter. A lot of you might have seen these tile cutting saw machines. They're really thin disc which is rotating at very high speed, sometimes 15, sometimes 20,000 RPM, rotations per minute plus. In the case of wood cutting saws, they are really high speed. Milling is not so high speed, at least not this kind of milling. CNC milling machine, yes, not the manual. So you can also slit. That is what tile cutting saws do. They slit the tile. These are some operations possible. There are many, many more. I will not discuss all of them. This is just to give you a flavor of what is possible, and all of this depends on the application of interest. The reason I am introducing all of these is because this is what you would have most likely used in the lab component of this course. There are many more, but I will not talk about them, like I said. All that was horizontal milling, to give you a sense of what is possible in vertical milling. Like I said earlier, the only difference between horizontal and vertical is the axis of the spindle. In that case, it was horizontal, parallel to the ground. In this case, it is perpendicular to the ground. That is the only difference. It's the same base, it's the same column, the same drive arrangement inside, the motor giving drive through a pulley, through a set of gears to the spindle is rotating, the tool is mounted on that spindle with a similar taper kind of arrangement. The workpiece is again kept on that table. The table translates in plane as well as up and down. So it has, now in this case, the z-axis is parallel to the tool, right? So the z-axis is the knee which moves up and down is the z-axis, and in plane is x and y. You can follow the right hand rule. So this is z, so this will be x, and in and out will be y. And that is all got again through a screw nut mechanism, where you have screws fixed between centers. The nut is connected to the knee or to the saddle or to the work or to the table, and it translates because the screws are rotating. The same kind of mechanism to get relative motion between the tool and the workpiece. The kind of operations possible on this machine are naturally different because the spindle is in a vertical configuration. So what you can make is, you can make slots. This is called a T-nut or a T-cutter. So you first make one slot in the horizontal configuration, or you can also do that using a cutter like this. So these cutters are now rotating in this axis, along their axis of rotation, they are rotating. They have these teeth along their axis, and there are many of these teeth, and there is engagement with the workpiece all along the axis. Similarly here, all along this height, There is cutting taking place, the same thing over here. So if you like, you can create a slot like this. This is called a T-slot. This is what is used on tables to fix workpieces. But to do that, you will first need to make a slot, which you can either make using what is called end milling, or you can take it to the horizontal configuration like I showed you earlier and create a slot with a slotting or a slitting cutter. You can also do face milling. This is like slab milling, where you are locally reducing the thickness of the workpiece. But face milling you can also do free form. It's not shown here, but it is possible. Very difficult in manual machines, but it is possible. When we talk about CNC milling machines, you will see that all this is a joke. End milling is one of the most common operations in all of milling, and it is end milling because you're cutting by the periphery of the cutter, so the ends of the cutter. That's why it's called end milling. And what you can do is you can make a pocket. This is very useful because it's very difficult to make a pocket with a face mill or with those straddle milling or with those slab milling. But end mill you can make a pocket. And what you're doing is the tool is just rotating and the workpiece you can move in plane. Right? You can move it in plane because you can simultaneously control with two handles how the workpiece moves in the XY plane because the Z axis is here. And you can move it up and down so you can increase the depth of the slot. It's a very useful operation used all the time. In fact, one of the most common operations in all of milling is end milling. Not any of these. This is the most common, end milling. Of course, there are many, many more. I cannot talk about them all possibly in this course. Even in an advanced level course where we talk about machining processes, we cannot cover the mechanics and the geometry of all of these cutters. There are many. But this is, like I said, just to give you a flavor. So what I tried to do in part 1 of this lecture was to introduce you and to give you an overview of the working principles of manual machines. And we spoke about the lathe machine, the possible operations on those lathe machines, turning, face turning, grooving, threading, face grooving, knurling, and many more. We spoke about how these things are clamped and chucked, which is a very interesting working principle. Then I discussed briefly the working principle of drilling machines, which is very similar to turning, but in turning instead of the workpiece rotating and drilling, the tool is rotating. And the workpiece is held stationary with just one axis motion. And the kind of operations possible on that is drilling and hole indulging and counter boring and counter sinking and so on. And then I briefly spoke about milling, which is multi-point cutting like drilling. Drilling is 2 points typically, milling is multi-point, can be 2, 10, 20, depends on the cutter geometry and your desired application. And in milling there can be two configurations, horizontal or vertical. Horizontal is when the spindle is horizontal and parallel to the ground, and vertical is when it is perpendicular to the ground. And that's essentially the difference between both. And because their spindle axes are different, the kind of operations possible on both machines are a little different. But essentially they are all milling operations. The motion to the workpiece for it to move in plane as well as move up and down is similar. They're all screw nut mechanisms. So in a way, everything that we introduced to you in the first lecture, we built on and brought into this part 1 of the second lecture. And I will now take a break. So we will close part 1 of lecture number 3 here, because this kind of concludes our discussions on manual machines. And then we'll come back again in part 2 of this lecture, lecture number 3, to talk about CNC machines and their working principles, and to see what the possibilities are with those machines. But that is part 2.